Story 1. I couldn't believe my luck when Tom asked me to be his Valentine. We'd been flirting at work for months, but I never thought he'd actually make a move. When he invited me over for a romantic dinner, I spent hours getting ready, curling my hair, putting on my sexiest dress, dabbing on perfume. My heart was racing as I knocked on his door that evening. Tom answered with a dazzling smile, looking handsome in a crisp button-down shirt. "Wow, you look incredible," he said, ushering me inside. His apartment was dimly lit with candles, soft music playing in the background. The table was set beautifully with fine china and crystal glasses. "This is amazing," I breathed, taking it all in. Tom poured us each a glass of wine, and we settled on the couch to chat before dinner. The conversation flowed easily as we laughed and exchanged stories. I felt like the night was perfect. Then, a sudden noise shattered the intimate moment. The front door unlocking aggressively, the handle rattling as if someone was breaking in. Tom's face drained of color as he shot up from the couch. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice tight with unease. I clutched my wine glass, my heart pounding as heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. The door burst open, and there she stood. A woman with wild, unkempt hair and eyes gleaming with unhinged delight. She wore a red dress, slightly wrinkled, as if she'd been waiting for this night for far too long. "Tom," she breathed, pressing a hand to her chest as if seeing him was a dream come true. "You didn't wait for me?" Tom took a cautious step back. "Jessica, what are you doing here?" Jessica's eyes flickered to me. Her smile faltered before twisting into something sinister. "Oh, you brought company?" Her tone was sickly sweet, but venom dripped beneath it. Before I could react, she lunged. A sharp pain cracked against my skull, and everything spun. My body collapsed onto the floor, my limbs weak and sluggish. Through my hazy vision, I saw Jessica shoving Tom into a chair, expertly tying his wrists with silky red ribbons. "I planned this night perfectly, Tom," she whispered, tightening the bonds until he winced. "Our Valentine's dinner, just the way it was supposed to be." My wrists burned as I struggled against the rope binding me to a chair across the room. Jessica twirled a knife between her fingers, her gaze locked onto Tom. "We were meant to be together," she cooed. "And she ruined everything." Tom's eyes flicked to me. "Jessica, please, let's not do anything crazy. Let's just start over." Her expression softened, as if she wanted to believe him. "Start over?" "Yeah," he said quickly. "But I need to freshen up first. I want to look perfect for you, just like old times." Jessica giggled, loosening her grip. "Oh, Tom, you always were such a charmer." She untied him hesitantly. "I'm sorry. He's spoken for," I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. "Oh, is that so?" she purred, her voice dripping with venom. "Well, it looks to me like he's all mine." With a swift motion, before I could even blink, she grabbed a roll of duct tape from the counter and lunged at me. I tried to dodge her, but she was too fast. In an instant, she had me pinned against the wall, her arm around my neck, and the silver tape threatening to seal my lips. "No!" Tom yelled, finally finding his voice. "You can have me. Just let her go." My heart ached for him. I couldn't believe he was willing. Jessica's eyes gleamed with a manic light as she turned to Tom, still keeping me pinned against the wall. "Oh, Tom," she cooed. "I knew you'd come around. We belong together, don't we?" Tom nodded frantically, his eyes darting between Jessica and me. "Yes, of course. Just let her go. Please." Jessica's grip on me loosened slightly, but she didn't release me entirely. "And what about her?" she hissed, jerking her head in my direction. "What is she to you?" Tom swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Nothing," he said, his voice cracking. "She's nothing to me, just a coworker. I was lonely, that's all. But I realize now that you're the only one for me, Jessica." Tom's words seemed to appease Jessica. She released me, pushing me roughly to the floor as she turned her full attention to Tom. "Oh, darling," she cooed. "I knew you'd come to your senses." "Of course," Tom said, forcing a smile. "In fact, we should call my mom right now and tell her the good news. She'll be thrilled to hear we're getting married." Jessica's eyes lit up. "Really? You want to marry me?" Tom nodded, reaching for his phone. "Absolutely. Here, why don't you call her? She's always loved you." As Jessica dialed with trembling fingers, Tom caught my eye and mouthed 911. I understood immediately. While Jessica gushed to Tom's mother about their impending nuptials, Tom discreetly texted the police. What happened next was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and shouting. The police burst through. Her expression morphed from joy to confusion to rage in a matter of seconds as she realized what was happening. "You lied to me!" she shrieked, lunging at Tom with surprising speed. But the officers were faster, tackling her to the ground before she could reach him. She thrashed and screamed as they cuffed her, her eyes wild with betrayal and fury. As they led her away, Tom rushed to my side, his hands shaking as he untied me. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen." I rubbed my wrists, wincing at the raw marks left by the ropes. "It's not your fault," I said, though my voice trembled. "But Tom, who was she? What just happened?" Tom sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "Jessica was my ex-girlfriend. We broke up 6 months ago, but she didn't take it well. She kept calling, showing up at my work. I thought if I just ignored her, she'd eventually move on." I sat beside him, my mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked up, his eyes filled with regret. I was embarrassed and scared, I guess. I thought if I pretended it wasn't happening, it would go away. I never imagined she'd do something like this. As the police finished gathering evidence and taking our statements, the apartment fell silent. The romantic dinner Tom had prepared sat untouched, candles burned down to stubs. "I understand if you want to leave," Tom said softly, unable to meet my eyes. "This isn't exactly the Valentine's Day I had planned." That was 3 years ago. Tom and I tried to make it work after that night. But the trauma of what happened lingered between us like an unspoken barrier. We drifted apart within a few months, the memory of our disastrous Valentine's Day casting a long shadow over our relationship. These days, I don't celebrate Valentine's Day anymore. The sight of heart-shaped chocolates and red roses in store windows makes my stomach churn, bringing back flashes of that terrifying night. Instead, I treat February 14th like any other day, focusing on self-care and spending time with friends who understand my aversion to the holiday. Sometimes I wonder what became of Jessica, if she got the help she so clearly needed. And Tom, well, I hope he found peace and happiness, free from the shadows of his past. As for me, I'm slowly learning to trust again, to open my heart to new possibilities. Story 2. I was single at the time. It was Valentine's Day, one of those days where the world seemed to pair up and love hung in the air like perfume. Everyone around me was wrapped up in their little romantic bubbles, couples holding hands, exchanging gifts, whispering sweet nothings. Meanwhile, I was at work, pretending not to care, even though deep down, I wished for something, anything, to break the monotony of being alone. The day dragged on, a constant reminder of my single status as I watched the minutes tick by, each one a little more painful than the last. I wasn't bitter, exactly. I just didn't expect anything to change. Not today. Then, just as I was starting to pack up my things and head home, the delivery guy appeared at the office. Never expected such a grand gesture at work. The delivery man's arms overflowed with a lush bouquet and an enormous teddy bear. My coworkers oohed and awed, speculating about my secret admirer. There's a mystery gift, too. The delivery man winked. I can send it to your home for free. What's the address? Flattered and curious, I scribbled it down without a second thought. The day dragged on, my mind consumed with possibilities. Finally home, I fumbled with my keys, eager to see what awaited me. The door swung open to darkness. My finger found the light switch, illuminating a nightmare. There he stood, the delivery man, grinning in my living room. "Surprise," he whispered. "I'm your mystery gift." My blood ran cold as I noticed the knife glinting in his hand. Time seemed to slow as adrenaline surged through my body. My mind raced, searching for an escape route, but I was frozen in place. "What's wrong?" he sneered, taking a step closer. "Didn't you want some company on Valentine's Day?" I backed away, my hand fumbling behind me for the doorknob. But he was faster, lunging forward and slamming the door shut. The sound echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. Now, he chided, wagging the knife. "Let's not be rude. I went to all this trouble for you." My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. The vase on the side table? Too far. My purse? Left at the door. "Well, what do you want?" I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. Time seemed to slow as my mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. The delivery man's eyes gleamed with a predatory intensity that made my skin crawl. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Didn't you want a Valentine?" I took a step back, my hand still on the doorknob. Fight or flight instincts battled within me as I weighed my options. The street outside was quiet, likely deserted at this hour. Screaming might not bring help in time. He advanced slowly, savoring my fear. "We're going to have such a lovely evening together," he purred. In that moment, survival overtook panic. I grabbed the vase of flowers from the side table and hurled it at his face with all my might. He stumbled, momentarily stunned, and I seized my chance. I bolted for the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound of shattering glass and his enraged roar followed me as I skidded around the corner. My trembling hands fumbled with the drawer, desperately searching for a weapon of my own. "You little bitch!" he snarled, his footsteps thundering closer. My fingers closed around the handle of a large chef's knife just as he burst into the kitchen. Without thinking, I whirled around and slashed wildly. He howled in pain as the blade caught his arm, but his momentum carried him forward. We crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The knife clattered away as we grappled. His hands found my throat, squeezing with terrifying strength. Spots danced before my eyes as I clawed at his face, fighting for air. My lungs burned, desperation giving me a final surge of strength. I managed to knee him hard in the groin, causing his grip to loosen just enough. I gasped for air, my vision clearing as I scrambled away. The knife lay just out of reach. I lunged for it, my fingers closing around the handle as he recovered. He charged at me with a roar of fury, but this time I was ready. I thrust the knife upward with all my might as he bore down on me. Time seemed to freeze as I felt the blade sink in. His eyes went wide with shock, his mouth forming a silent, "Oh." For a moment we stayed locked in that terrible embrace. Then, slowly, he crumpled to the floor. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the kitchen cabinets, the bloodied knife still clutched in my shaking hands. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at the motionless form on my kitchen floor. The knife slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering against the tile. For several long moments, I couldn't move, couldn't think. The only sound was my own pounding heartbeat. Finally, survival instincts kicked in. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, barely able to dial 911. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline as I choked out what had happened between sobs. "Stay on the line," she urged. "Help is on the way." It felt like an eternity before I heard sirens in the distance. When the police burst through my open door, weapons drawn, I nearly collapsed with relief. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, statements, and crime scene texts. I answered mechanically, still in shock. It wasn't until much later, sitting in the sterile brightness of the police station, that the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. An officer gently draped a blanket over my shoulders as a detective sat across from me, his face a mask of professional concern. "You did what you had to do," he said softly. It was self-defense, pure and simple. I nodded numbly, staring at my hands. They were clean now, but I could still feel the sticky warmth of blood. Would I ever forget that sensation? "We've identified him," the detective continued. "Turns out he's been targeting single women for months. You may have saved lives tonight." The words should have been comforting, but they felt hollow. All I could think about was how close I'd come to being another statistic, another tragic headline. "What was his name?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The detective glanced at his notes. "Jake Hollister. Worked at a Chipotle downtown." My blood ran cold. "Chipotle? The one on 5th Street?" He nodded, brow furrowing. "You know it?" I felt the room start to spin. My co-workers and I, we eat there all the time, at least once a week." Memories flooded back, snapshots I'd dismissed as unimportant. A friendly smile as he worked the line. Casual small talk about our jobs, our weekends. The way he'd linger near our table, wiping down nearby surfaces as we chatted and laughed. "Oh God," I whispered, bile rising in my throat. He knew everything about me. As I left the station hours later, the weight of it all still pressing heavily on my chest, I couldn't shake the thought. He knew everything about me. And now, every time I passed that Chipotle or walked past someone in a crowded street, I couldn't help but wonder, was he still out there, watching? Story 3. Valentine's Day was supposed to be special. Just the two of us in a secluded Airbnb in the woods, away from everything, away from the noise of the world, the distractions of everyday life. It was supposed to be an escape. But now, sitting on the edge of the bed in the darkened cabin, I could feel the overwhelming weight of something I couldn't quite explain. It had started innocently enough. My boyfriend, Adam, and I had booked the place months in advance. Something cozy, remote, and perfect for a quiet getaway. The listing had looked perfect. A charming rustic cabin surrounded by trees, a big fluffy bed with a fireplace. What more could we ask for? The host had seemed friendly in his messages, assuring us we'd have a peaceful time. He even mentioned that the cabin was family-owned, but there was something almost too charming about the way he said it. His tone made it sound as though he were trying to sell us on the idea of the place. Too hard, too fast. When we arrived, the cabin was just as picturesque as the photos, charming, with creaky wooden floors and an atmosphere that immediately made us feel at ease. We unpacked, made some tea, and laughed about the oddities of the place. The way the lights flickered when we turned them on, the strange smell in the upstairs bedroom. But it wasn't anything to worry about. It was just an old house, and we were both excited to relax. But then, something shifted. Around 2 a.m., Adam and I were lying in bed, both of us half asleep. We were wrapped in each other's warmth, the quiet of the woods surrounding us. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. That's when I heard it. A faint, screeching sound. I thought it was just my imagination at first, but then it came again, closer this time. It was a high-pitched scream, one that sounded like it was coming from somewhere upstairs. I sat up in bed, heart suddenly racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Adam froze, his eyes wide as he listened. He nodded slowly. I did. The house was so quiet that even the faintest sound felt amplified. I could feel the cold sweat gathering on my palms as my mind began to race. Who was upstairs? The Airbnb had an attic. Was someone up there? Was it the host? A loud metallic clank followed by a deep, gut-wrenching screech made my skin crawl. It sounded like a drill, sharp, sudden, and very out of place. Adam's eyes widened in realization. What the hell is going on up there? I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his skin. Adam, this is bad. We need to check this out. He shook his head quickly, his face pale. Number. We're staying here. There's something wrong with this place. I don't want to go upstairs. He was right to be terrified. There was something in the air now, something thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening in that attic. The sound of the drill persisted, followed by another scream. This one more frantic, more desperate. I wanted to leave, to grab our things and run out of there, but there was a problem. The door to the cabin, the main door we'd come in through, had a very strange lock. It was a bolt lock, and when we had first arrived, the host had made a point of telling us that it locked from the outside. That's what made the whole thing feel off in the first place. He didn't say why, just that it was an old door, and, for our own safety, the lock was standard. But now, in the dark, the words "locked from the outside" sent a wave of panic over me. Adam, we need to lock the door. We need to make sure we're safe. He nodded quickly, his hands trembling as he reached for the lock. But before he could turn it, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A voice. Quiet at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. We need to leave. The voice was pleading, desperate, but it sounded muffled, like it was coming through a wall, a voice that wasn't our own. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The weight of terror seemed to settle over me like a thick, suffocating blanket. Adam, visibly pale and shaking, managed to lock the door. His face was rigid with fear. We need to call the police. He grabbed his phone, but as soon as he looked at the screen, his face twisted in confusion. There's no signal. I can't get a signal. My pulse quickened. We were completely cut off. The sound of the drill from the attic continued, the whirring now mixed with a rhythmic banging, as if something heavy was being thrown against the floor. That's it. We're not staying here. Adam stood up, pulling me with him as he grabbed his jacket. But just as we made it to the front door, there was a sharp, rattling bang, like something heavy had been thrown against the door from the other side. We both jumped back, staring at the door in horror. I could barely breathe. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. It felt like a nightmare, a terrible, suffocating nightmare I couldn't escape from. Shh, Adam whispered. He motioned for us to be quiet. We can't make a sound. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I was sure he could hear it too. Suddenly, the door handle rattled as if someone on the outside was trying to get in. Do you hear that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Shh, Adam said again, his eyes wide with terror. Stay quiet. We need to get out of here. But as we backed away from the door, the sound of the drill grew louder. More screams, more banging. The voice, the one that had been muffled before, was now clear. Please, help me. It sounded like a woman. No, it was definitely a woman. The terror in her voice cut straight through me. Without thinking, I rushed to the stairs, adrenaline surging through me. Adam grabbed my arm, pulling me back. Don't, we can't do this. It's too dangerous. I shook him off. I can't just sit here, someone's in trouble, we need to help them. I bolted up the stairs, the sound of Adam's frantic footsteps behind me. When we reached the attic door, the noise was deafening, the drilling, the muffled screams. I had to know what was happening up there. I had to see it. I took a deep breath and tried the door. It was locked. Get something, I whispered, trying to steady my breath. Get something to break it down. Adam rushed to the hallway, grabbing a vase. He slammed it against the door, but the lock held firm. With trembling hands, he tried again, but it was no use. That's when we heard it. The sound of footsteps from behind the door. Slow, deliberate. We both froze. every hair on our bodies standing on end. The door creaked open just enough to let a shadow slip through. A figure, tall and dark, with a face that was barely visible in the dim light. "Run," Adam whispered, grabbing my hand. But I couldn't move. The figure stepped forward. "You're too late," a cold voice said. "There's no escaping now." I felt the blood drain from my face as we were pushed backward, the door slamming shut behind us. But in the instant before everything went black, a rush of clarity hit me. The shadow, the figure. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even human. It was a ghost. A soul trapped in the attic, never meant to leave. And then, it was over. The darkness swallowed us whole. One moment, we were in the attic, the air thick with terror, heartbeats crashing in my chest, the dark figure looming over us. Everything felt suffocating, like we had no air left to breathe. And then, nothing. The world tilted on its axis as though time itself had bent and fractured. It felt like we were being yanked backward, caught in some invisible force that tore us away from that twisted scene. The cold fingers of panic loosened their grip just as quickly as they had clutched at us. The room, no, the house, seemed to collapse around us in one shuddering breath. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back in our room. The bed was soft beneath me. The room was still, the faintest crack of moonlight leaking through the curtains. I gasped, sitting upright with such force that the world spun for a moment. My head throbbed. Adam was lying next to me, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. His face was relaxed, like he had never been gripped by terror, never been nearly dragged into the abyss of that figure. But I knew what I had felt. I couldn't shake the weight of it. My skin was still buzzing with fear, the lingering feeling of something unnatural, that thing, pressing against me. I reached for my phone, my hands still trembling. The screen flickered for a moment, just a quick flash of static, before settling. I checked the time, 2:34 a.m. Had we somehow just blinked, and everything that had happened before was a nightmare? But no, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real. Too real. I could still hear the pounding of the figure's heavy, slow footsteps in my mind. I could still see its shadow in my mind's eye, a shape that never fully materialized, but was undeniably there, a presence that pressed into the corners of the room. I could still feel its weight. It had been more than just a ghost. It had been something ancient, something that had been trapped for far too long in that attic. It wasn't until I reached for Adam, shaking his shoulder, that I realized something was wrong. His skin was cold, unnaturally cold. His eyes fluttered open slowly, as if he were struggling to return from somewhere distant. "Adam?" I whispered. "Adam, are you okay?" He groaned, rubbing his face with a hand, clearly disoriented. "What happened?" I sat back, my pulse racing. "Do you remember what happened? The figure in the attic? The screams?" Adam's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? We're in the room. We've been here this whole time." My throat tightened. His words hit me like a slap, each one sending a spike of fear into my spine. "Adam, no. We were in the attic, incredulous." I reached for his arm, feeling his warmth, his pulse beneath my fingers. He was real, right? The touch didn't feel wrong. But how could he not remember what had just happened? How could he not recall that cold, shadowy presence looming over us? And then, a sinking realization hit me, the kind that stops you from breathing. I looked around the room, and there was something else I hadn't noticed before. Something that made my blood run cold. The door to our room, the one we'd locked earlier, was now open, slightly ajar. How was that possible? There was no way that door could have been left open. It had been bolted, locked from the outside. And yet, here it was, standing as if it had never been touched. I stood up, my legs shaking. The walls seemed to close in, and I could still feel the remnants of that shadow in my skin. I walked slowly toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears, every instinct telling me to stay away from it, to stay far from that threshold. But I needed to see. As I reached the door, my fingers brushed against the frame, the cold wood shocking against my skin. I pushed it open just enough to see the hallway outside. Empty, still, and silent. It was almost too quiet. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. I dared to step out into the hallway, my breath shallow. The flickering lights from the cabin had returned to normal. Nothing was out of place. Nothing. Except the oppressive feeling that was hanging in the air. The same feeling I had when I stepped into the house for the first time. The sense that something wasn't right. But now it was worse. Adam followed me and I turned back to him, my eyes wide with fear. Do you remember nothing? It wasn't just a dream. He cut me off, his voice almost too calm. I told you, I don't remember anything. Maybe we were just having a bad dream. But even as he said that, his voice didn't sound right. It wasn't the voice I had known. It was as though there was something different about him now. His words were empty, distant, almost like he was still somewhere else. I felt that same dread crawl up my spine as I stared at him. That wasn't Adam. And then, I realized something. The figure, the darkness, the trap. It wasn't done with us. We had never left. That thing in the attic, it wasn't trying to kill us. It wasn't after our lives. It was after something else. It was after our souls, our minds. And in the moments when we'd been caught, when everything had gone black, it had swallowed us whole. And when we woke up, it had spat us out. That was the thing with entities like this. They didn't need to kill you. They only needed to make you forget. Leave you adrift, uncertain, trapped in your own mind. To leave you wondering whether what you experienced was real, or just a figment of your imagination. Because once you begin to doubt your own mind, you begin to question everything around you. And the darkness? It wasn't finished. It was still with us. Watching. Waiting.